Looks like I'm talking about net neutrality, boys. Strap up because this is going to be a fun one. Net neutrality is one of the most misunderstood and obnoxious concepts in the internet, if I'm being frank. If you're not already familiar, the idea of net neutrality is that your internet service provider cannot treat traffic from different sources differently. So if I am some random startup competing with YouTube and you want to go to my website, I, as the provider, shouldn't have to pay a special fee to Comcast in order for you to get that traffic. The idea of net neutrality is meant to preserve the fair and equal access web so that random companies don't get priced out in competition. It's super important for keeping the web the way we want to keep it, fair and open to everyone. So whoever makes the best solution can eventually win. The problem isn't that net neutrality was axed in the US. It was, but it's largely come back. The problem has much more to do with overseas, particularly in South Korea, where bandwidth costs are as high as 40 times higher per megabyte than they are in the US. Obviously, some amount of that has to do with the unique complexity of getting the networks all working. However, we shouldn't be paying as the service provider for every single byte that happens to go through Korea and then deal with the weird price gouging that the two providers that make up the majority of South Korea's internet end up enforcing. This isn't just something I'm here to complain about for the sake of it. This is actually affecting a meaningful portion of my audience because somewhat recently, Twitch decided to pull out of South Korea entirely. An update on Twitch in Korea. This is written by Dan Clancy, DJ Clancy, the current CEO of Twitch. This morning, I shared with our community in Korea that we've made the difficult decision to shut down the Twitch business in Korea on February 27th next year. We understand that this is extremely disappointing news, and we wanted to explain why we made this decision and how we're planning to support those impacted. Ultimately, the cost to operate Twitch in Korea is prohibitively expensive, and we have spent significant effort working to reduce these costs so we could find a way for the Twitch business to remain in Korea. First, we experimented with a peer-to-peer model for source quality. Then we adjusted source quality to a maximum of 720p. While we have lowered costs from these efforts, our network fees in Korea are still 10 times more expensive than in most other countries. Twitch has been operating in Korea at a significant loss, and unfortunately, there is no pathway forward for our business to run more sustainably in that country. To all of our global communities, we want to make it clear that this is a unique situation. Operating costs in Korea are significantly higher than they are in other countries, and we have been open about this challenge for some time. Twitch streamers in Korea have devoted significant time and effort into building their communities, and we plan to help them find new homes, even if it's regrettably not on Twitch. We will work to help Twitch streamers in Korea move their communities to alternative live streaming services in Korea. We are also reaching out to several of those services to help with the transition, and will communicate with impacted streamers as those discussions progress. Yeah, not great that they had to do this. Cloudflare back in 2016. And from everything I know, things have actually gotten worse since. So in Asia, excluding the Middle East, transit costs 7 times the benchmark. Let's assume the cost of transit in Europe and North America is 10 units. With that benchmark in place, without disclosing exact pricing, we can compare regions accordingly. So the transit cost in Europe is 10 units. In America, it's roughly the same or 10 units. Most of Asia traffics 7 times the benchmark, so 70 units. However, they peer about 60% of the traffic, which knocks it all the way down to 28 units instead, because again, they're billing infrastructure to user. So if you find ways for things to peer within the network in these countries, they're not going to bill on that, so you can meaningfully reduce the cost, which is also why Twitch was trying peer-to-peer for their streaming stuff too, keeping it off of Twitch's infra, preventing a lot of those billings from occurring. That said, the default cost being 7x is pretty bad. 2 Asian locations stand out as being especially expensive: Seoul and Taipei. In these markets, with powerful incumbents, Korea Telecom and HyNet, transit costs 15 times as much as in Europe or North America. That is terrifying. And the majority of why that's the case is these two companies run the vast majority of the infrastructure in Korea. Absolute madness. South Korea is perhaps the only country in the world where bandwidth costs are going up. This may be driven by new regulations from the Ministry of Science, which mandate the commercial terms of domestic interconnection based on predetermined tiers of participating networks. This is contrary to how things work in the rest of the world, where networks self-regulate and often peer without settlement. The government even prescribes the rate at which prices should decrease per year, which is significantly slower than the annual drop in unit bandwidth costs elsewhere in the world. We're only able to peer about 2% of our traffic in South Korea. They make it incredibly hard to peer your traffic there. If you include HyNet and Korea Telecom in our blended bandwidth pricing and take into account peering, our effective price unit is 28 units. If you exclude them, it goes down to 14. So the price of traffic in Korea as a whole for Cloudflare doubles just because of these two internet service providers. That's insane. I don't know how to put into words just how absurd this is. Bandwidth is already really expensive. Doubling the cost of all of Asia because of these two providers in Korea is insanity. There's a great article on Tech Dirt that goes in depth on just how absurd this is. As they've pointed out in a few articles now, apparently. Let me see. Yeah. 2 years ago in October, Netflix had similarly absurd problems. Previously, AT&T in the US was claiming that big tech gets a free ride, which is just bullshit. And now Korea is doing the same thing. South Korea internet service provider SK Broadband has sued Netflix to pay for costs from increased network traffic and maintenance work because of a surge of viewers to the US firm's content, a South Korean spokesperson said on Friday. This move comes after a Seoul court said Netflix should reasonably give something in return to the internet service provider for network usage. And multiple South Korean lawmakers have spoken out against content providers who do not pay for network usage despite generating explosive traffic. For a comparison, so you guys better understand this, imagine if Ford sued gas stations for putting gas in your car. Gas stations are putting gas into your car so it runs. If more people need to drive and more people are using their Ford cars, those gas stations should be kicking some money back. It's absurd. The cost of running the service per megabyte doesn't go up when Netflix does well. The users are the ones paying for the number of megabytes. They've paid for an allocation. And depending on where that comes from, they're rebilling on the other side. It's absolute nonsense. It's like, the only word I could think of to describe this is corruption. It's horrifying. If we go back to this article for the Twitch leaving the entire market, we have the quote from the blog post we just read, and then their thoughts, which is, for the better part of the last few decades, global telecom giants have been trying to double dip. Again, trying to break net neutrality so they can bill both sides of the equation. This idea is that big ISPs are inherently owed a cut of the revenues of services traveling over their networks. And this is what started the net neutrality wars around the world several decades ago, where AT&T insisted Google wouldn't ride on their pipes for free. And yeah, it's only getting dumber every day. Under Korea's model, edge providers like Netflix are forced to pay network service fees to ISPs. Basically, ISPs claim they're inherently owed money if a TV show on Netflix is super popular, claiming they should be compensated for the extra bandwidth. ISPs are supposed to build networks that can handle any peak capacities caused by normal consumer demand. Consumers and edge providers have already paid an arm and a leg for bandwidth, particularly if regional monopolization has driven down any incentive to compete on price. It's absurd. We're at the point in the US where one of the best options for your internet is getting a T-Mobile modem for a phone and throwing that in a router and just not using the cable that's run on the ground because they can charge you arbitrary amounts. And there's a little more competition once those things are in the air. It's crazy how bad things have gotten here, to the point where Netflix is getting sued and Twitch is just giving up and leaving. Like, holy hell. How are we at that point? When I was at Twitch, it was well known how absurdly expensive Korea was to operate in. But here we are. It's over. And there's no one to blame other than the corruption that allowed these providers to do this. This is also why net neutrality is so important. Imagine if this happened in the US. Imagine how much our way of using the internet would have to change if these services were getting billed on top of us being billed for traffic that they should be providing based on the terms we already have. It's just insanity. And this is why it's so important that we push hard for net neutrality, not just in the US, but around the world. I can't believe this happened. I genuinely can't. And my heart goes out to everybody in Korea who is losing their community and possibly even their job as a result. This needs to change. And I'm sincerely hopeful that we see a future where everybody has fair and equal access to the internet. Because right now we don't. And I'm terrified of what that means. If you want to hear more about terrifying monopolies destroying the internet, I'll pin a video about Google and Gmail in the corner there. If you've already seen that, there's one below YouTube seems to think you'll like. Appreciate y'all as always. I'll see you in the next one. Peace, nerds.